Act 5, Scene 2. This is the last scene of the play, aka the one where I learned how to use emojis. Hamlet, newly arrived from his aborted journey to England, recounts to Horatio what happened. Famous line check here: a divinity that shapes our ends, indicating the philosophical mood that Hamlet has entered ever since his last soliloquy. The Grand Commission is the letter that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were instructed to present to England when they arrived. It also specifically called for Hamlet's head to be chopped right off on arrival. Hamlet talks about how he used to hate taking classes on how to write fancy, but it turned out those classes, like Mr. Choi's insistence on killing linking verbs, eventually paid off. He devised a new letter in a style that would have done Polonius proud. The repetition of phrases beginning with "as England," "as love between them," "as peace should still," "and stand," and "many," are all a bunch of words that signify nothing. We don't get to the good stuff until the bottom of the paragraph, where he writes the instructions that his old friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern should be immediately executed, without shriving time, a chance to confess away their sins. He sealed the letter with wax using the signet ring he had from his father, giving it a very official royal look. Also, Hamlet has come a long way from the indecisive prince that we saw earlier. He has no regrets about sending them to their deaths. They knew what they were in for when they tried to play the game. There's a possible hint of resentment towards Claudius here, in that he cut in line in front of Hamlet to fulfill his ambitions. However, he is genuinely sorry about getting into that tussle with Laertes. Osric, a courtier, none of whom come across as particularly useful or intelligent in this play, brings a message to the prince. Hamlet and Horatio exchange words to indicate what they know about Osric, mostly that he's an idiot. Hamlet proceeds to play a game that might be familiar if you remember the exchange with Polonius about clouds that look like various animals. Hamlet asks the lackey to put his hat on his head. When Osric complies, Hamlet tells him to remove the hat. And we repeat this a couple of times until Osric finally says, "No, really, I need to deliver this message." And, like that letter Hamlet wrote to England, Osric proceeds to use 100 words to say nothing, only to have Hamlet and Horatio make fun of him and ask him to speak a bit more, even pointing out at a certain point that he's used up all of his good vocabulary and has run out of words. By line 156, Osric starts talking about the terms of this duel and its accompanying bets. Not really important stuff for the plot, but there, I suppose, to minimize possible suspicion on Hamlet's part. When we get to the terms of the actual duel, Osric informs Hamlet that because Laertes is the better fencer, Hamlet will start with a point advantage or a handicap. Hamlet's question here, "What if I answer no?" brings up the brief possibility that he could really throw a wrench into Claudius's plans by simply not agreeing to this invitation. Where would the play have gone from there? However, it seems that Hamlet is just as eager as his uncle to get to it, so he accepts and dismisses Osric. Horatio and Hamlet have just enough time to talk about how useless people like that are, before another lord, unnamed this time, enters to ask if Hamlet is ready. I'm honestly not sure why Shakespeare chose to introduce this character instead of just using Osric, but perhaps he felt it necessary to give Horatio and Hamlet a couple of different moments alone together. Horatio, understandably suspicious of the open nature of this trap, tells Hamlet that this is definitely a trap, and he should not walk into it. More famous lines from Hamlet about defying augury, and biblical references about providence in the fall of a sparrow, how God has a plan for everything. Again, this is a Hamlet who's much more comfortable with his destiny and the responsibilities required with it. The readiness is all. We switch to the throne room, or dueling room, some large space where the final portion of the play takes place. All of these garnishings with the trumpets, drums, and officers calls back to the contempt with which Hamlet describes Claudia's ruling style to Horatio way back in Act 1. You might remember him mentioning how annoying it is that Claudius likes to fire cannons and get drunk just for kicks, and how it gives Denmark a bad reputation among its neighbors. Well, Claudius has arrived with fanfare, cannons, and drink. Hamlet comes immediately to the point to apologize to Laertes, as well as to let him know that it was not his usual self, but the madness speaking for him. Although by modern standards, this seems like a pretty weak apology, the sentiment expressed here seems genuine. Laertes also indicates that he's pretty good with his apology, although his honor forbids him from calling off the duel. He adds more words that he doesn't need to reassure Hamlet that nothing here is personal anymore. There's an important mandatory English literary term here that you should know. The foil refers not to Reynolds rap, but to, as the dictionary says, a person or thing that contrasts with and so emphasizes and enhances the qualities of another, or a thin leaf of metal placed under a precious stone to increase its brilliance. Because everything has to be wordplay with Hamlet, both definitions apply here. Laertes, like Hamlet, experienced the premature death of his father by violence, possible feelings of thwarted ambition because of his almost but not quite gaining of the throne, a strong sense of filial obligation to do right by his father's memory, and a likely inflated sensitivity to masculine identity issues that confuse him from figuring out what the right thing to do is. See also Prince Fortinbras, for whom everything I just said also applies. The pleasantries exchanged, the two men moved to the taking of swords, with Laertes pretending to look around before settling on the one with the poison. Claudius stays true to character by announcing the terms of celebration. When Hamlet gets a point, the cannons will fire in celebration, and drinking of alcohol will commence. Hamlet's probably rolling his eyes throughout this, making knowing eye contact with Horatio while they both judge Claudius. The duel begins, and Hamlet quickly scores the first point, confirmed by Osric, serving double duty as the judge here. Claudius interrupts to offer Hamlet a celebratory cup of not poison. Fanfare, trumpets, and cannons interrupt. Hamlet says, "Nah, fam, I'm good." He quickly scores a second point, and in what is either a sign of extreme helicopter parenting or perhaps guilt-inflicted self-sacrifice, Gertrude takes the poisoned cup and offers a toast to Hamlet's fortune. Claudius, quickly realizing that one flaw in his plan was that he neglected to handcuff the cup to his wrist, tries to stop his wife. This presents a really interesting dilemma for actors who play Gertrude. The Ethan Hawke version of Hamlet has his mom offering a knowing look to the king before deliberately downing the poisoned cup, like she was in on the earlier schemes and can't live with herself anymore. In contrast, Glenn Close's Gertrude in Braveheart's version of Hamlet plays it pretty cluelessly, just reaching for the worst possible choice of drink in order to accidentally foil her husband's plans. Laertes promises to start playing better, but also offers this remorseful note before dueling resumes. The following exchange is pretty vaguely described, and Shakespeare didn't seem too interested in offering specific directions for how this would go. Taken literally, you can stage this with a couple of actors wrestling with each other, grappling for each other's swords, with all the subtext implied with that. However, I like the David Tennant approach to this one, where Laertes, less remorseful and more frustrated, chooses to approach Hamlet from behind during this time out, and scratches him with the sword. Hamlet, enraged by this poor sportsmanship, chases wildly after Laertes, who drops his sword in an attempt to create distance. Although that particular blocking does not paint Laertes in a good light, it does offer a more clear picture as to how the same poisoned sword ends up stabbing not one but both duelists. Our first death of the scene occurs, but not before Gertrude manages to, with her last breath, call attention to the poisoned cup. Hamlet calls for the doors to be sealed up, and Laertes throws his partner under the bus, admitting to the foul play and helpfully letting Hamlet know he's a dead man. The prince stabs the king, then to make doubly sure that Claudius doesn't make any last-minute comebacks, shoves the poison down his throat. Laertes seems genuinely remorseful here, forgiving Hamlet for stabbing him with the poisoned sword and asking for forgiveness in return. Act 5 takes its second and third victims. Hamlet, aware of his inevitable death, uses his plot armor to wring out a last couple of speeches. Horatio demonstrates his loyalty as a true friend to the last, trying to grab the poisoned cup to take some himself rather than live in a world without his best friend. Side note, we should all aspire to be someone's Horatio, sans the suicidal ideation, of course. Hamlet stops him from drinking because 1. Horatio's his friend, and 2. Somebody needs to be alive to tell the story to others, specifically Fortinbras, who has just arrived from conquering Poland and is now conveniently checking into Elsinore. Hamlet mentions again that he's dying, but not before his endorsement of Fortinbras as the next king of Denmark, A series of iconic lines here, Hamlet ending on "the rest is silence" before breathing out his last, and Horatio getting the tear-jerking lines of "laying the sweet prince to rest with the angels." Fortinbras gets to enter a castle filled with dead bodies everywhere. At the same time, an ambassador from England arrives wanting to know where that payment they were promised for executing Rosencrantz and Guildenstern is. Horatio is left with the burden of grieving his friend, explaining what happened, and telling the ambassador that, sorry, you were pranked. Fortinbras settles in to let Horatio tell this sad tale, noting that the nearby throne looks like a really nice place to sit, and he may as well claim it. After Horatio starts explaining, Fortinbras instructs his soldiers to bear Hamlet's body out like a soldier's, offering the generous, if not supported by any semblance of textual evidence, assessment that Hamlet probably would have made a good king had he been given the chance. In one last note of irony, Fortinbras instructs the soldiers to honor Hamlet with some form of artillery or gunshot, and the play ends with the sound of ordnance, although this time not in celebration, but in mourning.